here we see the view from Fort Niagara looking across the Niagara River towards where Fort George is. This is on the path towards the Dolphin Battery and the Gate of Five Nations seen here. This is the entryway into the fort. We see here the fleur-de-lis, the signal of the French. As we walk through the Gate of Five Nations, we enter into Fort Niagara, where we will come across the South Redoubt. Along here are the hills which were used against defense from the Seneca during the British occupation. Walking through here, we now see the South Redoubt. It was built by the British in 1771. The South Redoubt was built to reinforce the fort after deterioration occurred from the original French build. The French castle is known as the most prominent landmark of Fort Niagara. Construction on the French castle was completed in 1727 and was the result of years of persuasion by French to the Iroquois, who finally agreed for a French post to be built at Fort Niagara. However, unknowingly, it was built as a military outpost, not as a trading post as they presumed. We enter now into the powder room, which was used to store gunpowder. It was on the western front of the fort along the river. At the time of its construction, the powder room was placed in a convenient location. However, following the building of Fort George, it became a liability rather than an asset. Walking in here is one of the buildings that was turned into a museum site following the formation of the Old Niagara Fort Association. There are maps throughout the room. This one is of the Niagara Portage on a large table. We see here the falls going into the river where the portage followed. Here is where entry into Lake Erie happened. Up here we have the cannons. Panning across the camera is Fort George across the river, showing just how close the two were. These cannons were used for defense during the War of 1812 and were constructed at that time as well. Looking here is Lake Ontario to show you the easy access that ships had and why Fort Niagara was such a strategic location. This building is the Bakehouse, one of the busiest in Fort Niagara, utilized by the French who constructed it and the British and American garrisons until 1870. We now enter into the French castle, where we are at the main dining room, which was originally constructed by the French. This is the second floor chapel. It was a Jesuit chapel at first, and it was used by many to pray and receive penance during their times. This is one of the barracks on the lower level where soldiers would sleep. This is the first floor of the castle, which was primarily used as living quarters. The back of the building was reserved for officers, furthest away from the entry points. The officers typically had suites that they could enter through that were connected along the back of the house. Walking in here is a coat room. You can see the stone that was originally built is still in the French castle, the old wooden doors. This is a private dining room in the officers' quarters, which would be connected to a bedroom, as we'll see coming up. The layout of the French castle, as we can see with the windows facing lakeside, this was beneficial because officers and soldiers could see any incoming ships that were coming towards them. Here we have the officers' private study in a 3-part room, where we'll now walk into the bedroom. So the officers would have a bedroom, an office, and a dining room, which was much more than the soldiers who would sleep in barracks down in the bottom. This is the attic of the French castle. The use of the attic is not completely known during the French era, as it's not heated. It was probably used for storage, but during the War of 1812, Americans used it to mount cannons in the windows. Out here, we have a look towards the stone, which is dedicated to Paul Cohen of the Old Fort Niagara Association. And then here we have pictures of my time at Fort Niagara and a few memories. Thank you for watching.
All right.